lot of magazines or shows that I've been interviewed on are focused on curb appeal, and rightly so, because their audience is looking for curb appeal or for architectural pictures that are pretty, and I understand that because that's usually what I look for as an audience too. But sadly, in those articles, the angle of the political angle gets missed sometimes because that's not the focus. What I'm really happy to talk to you about is just how a small house is not just a twee, cute little house. It's a very political, very there's a lot of leverage in a small space. It shows people how simply we can all live. Not all, but anyway, there's a large margin between 100 square feet and 3,000 square feet. Something to consider, and probably more importantly to me, it's a form of civil disobedience for me. When I heard that it was illegal to live in a small house, that's pretty much the day I decided I had to live in a small house. I wanted to show that this is not a dangerous thing. It's not a safety issue. It's not a well-being issue. Small houses have been derided for a long time. Mansions are what we've come to assume to be luxurious, and it's really not the case. It's a bit ironic that it's the mansions that are really the debtors' prisons, and it's sometimes the smaller houses that are luxurious. The luxury I'm talking about is freedom. Because once you're free from a mortgage, from a large mortgage, and you're free from all the maintenance and the worries that go along with a larger structure, and just free from the very idea of extra stuff that you're not using. Of course, if you're using it because it really makes you happy, because it's a status symbol and that makes you happy, that's one thing, because you really need it if it makes you happy. But I don't think it's making that many people happy. That's my impression anyway. So the freedom in living small is really... It's just freedom from want, and the freedom to live with what you need and not what you don't need. Well, I think there's a process when you're simplifying your life and paring down to live really small. And that process in itself is the hardest part. Once you're in, it's easy. You're totally liberating. You're free from all your extra stuff that you didn't really need, that you thought you needed. But deciding what you need and what you don't need and getting rid of all that stuff is very difficult. And there are a lot of people who think it's going to be a breeze, but the breeze doesn't start until after you've gotten rid of all that. At that point, things do get easy. Yeah, I don't know why more people aren't pissed off about the zoning and building codes that prohibit small houses. It's actually illegal to live in a very small house. And the codes that prohibit these things were actually developed largely by the housing industry. The housing industry can easily buy a membership or sponsor the organization that creates the codes. And, for that matter, the organization that creates the codes, or the original codes, were created essentially by the insurance industry, who had exclusive rights to creating these codes at that time. And it's just been an evolution of basically mandatory consumption laws ever since. We have to live in fairly large houses. We have to live in them in a certain area. We can't live in other areas in small houses. I mean, you can live in a tiny house on wheels if you live in a trailer park. That's pretty much it, unless you can find another loophole. And there are just a few here and there. I guess my goal is just to hopefully empower other people by showing them some of the loopholes around the mandatory consumption laws, and to show them that it is possible to live well with less too.
And some of the loopholes around that you found going the RV route.
Yeah, there are a few codes that govern the form of RVs, but they're a lot more lax than those codes that determine the form of our housing, And they're a lot more reasonable, I think. They haven't been guided so much by the housing industry as the other codes, and they allow us to live a lot more sustainably than the other codes would at this point. So I think that it's good that we still have a few loopholes. I'm hoping that they remain. We'll see how it goes, but they're very attractive right now.
What's the smallest house you could build legally in this county?
Yeah.
Counties around here.
Well, the way the building codes usually work is that they're developed at a national level. It's actually called the International Code Council, even though it just applies to North America. These codes are then adopted. It's not a governmental agency, but they're adopted by state governments, which then delegate them to municipalities. And the only way that the governments, local governments, have been able, or the state governments have been able to get away with this is by claiming that this is for our own safety and well-being, which are things that should be delegated to the state according to the Constitution. And yet, what's happened is that the codes that have been posing as safety laws way exceed any statistics on what is safe, even as egress. For that matter, just requiring so much square footage for a room has nothing to do with safety. You know, the average American house now puts 18 tons worth of greenhouse gases per year. An additional 7 tons worth of construction waste into the local landfill, consumes a lot of resources, about a quarter acre of woodland in its production.
Even the lead homes.
Oh yeah, even LEED certification is funny to me. I mean, thank goodness we're trying to think of ways to regulate excess, or just at least look at sustainability, and at least we're trying to think about it. But we're so stuck in this additive mentality that even LEED, with its good intentions, is mostly an additive process. You know, throw another solar panel on the roof, let's make it more green. Let's add this, let's add that. By the time you're done, I was in a 6,000 square foot home for one person just less than a month ago that had platinum LEED certification. I understand it's well-intentioned, but still I think there's a lot of work to be done. There are a lot of zoning issues around how you can use your RV, and you can't really live in your RV in your yard, but you can camp out. Typically, you can camp out in your yard in the RV that's stored there, and you can camp out every night as long as you're not calling it living in. I do know that a few cities have now made it illegal to camp out in your own yard, which is I think we should start looking at the Fifth Amendment again, because there are some actual constitutional issues around dictating what people can do on their own property. And I think that maybe a few of these municipalities have maybe crossed the line. I know that as far as common sense goes, they crossed the line long ago. But even in terms of law, I think that it's time to reevaluate what we're allowing citizens of the U.S. to do, purportedly free citizens of the United States, and maybe allow for people to actually live more sustainably and live freer, as we purportedly are supposed to. But the restrictions put on us that require us to live large have been just really eroding our culture. When I listened to the news recently and hear reports on why it is that there was an economic breakdown, nothing is mentioned of the fact that some of us were forced into houses that are bigger than we can afford. The banks follow suit by requiring us to buy so much square footage in order to get a loan. I think trailer parks might be the wave of the future. I think that there's a great, not a perfect, but a great model there for zoning. It's already established, this zoning clause, that allows for what essentially is the last form of widespread community in this country. And the suburbs certainly aren't doing it. I guess there is now co-housing in other forms. But in general, our recent history has been, the trailer park is the only place where people actually exist and communicate with each other. And despite all of the derogatory associations we have with trailer parks, I think they have great potential. And I love the idea of building a trailer park with great architecture in it and putting all of the cars and the vehicles, at least the cars, out back rather than making them the focus in the middle, and putting the people in the middle and the houses right there too, so that all of the living space is right there at the core of the complex.
Once you left your big house with your family, your 4,000 square foot house, what happened then that led you from that point to this?
Well, after I left home, my 4,000 square foot mansion of a home, I had been interested in going to architecture school for a long while, but wound up in art school because it's a lot cheaper and the math requirements aren't nearly as scary. So went to the University of Iowa, and I wound up living in about, well over 20 places. I think it was closer to 30 places between first days of undergraduate school and then finishing graduate school at City College of New York in art with painting and drawing degrees. But always had that interest in architecture, and had lived in a lot of different situations, ranging from dormitories to the back of my pickup truck. And after living in the back of a pickup truck, or for that matter in a dormitory with 12 people in one room, living in a very small house is actually very luxurious. So I did go about designing and building my own small house shortly after, about 10 years after getting out of grad school. I finally moved into my first hand-built home.
How did you know, or maybe you didn't, maybe you built a series of small houses to got it right? What happened?
I had designed a lot of little sort of sacred architecture pieces, because at the end of painting school I really got more into 3D style and architectural style things, and put those into galleries, so it was sort of artsy-fartsy. But eventually, you can only store so many of those things, especially if you don't like having a lot of stuff around. And you can't sell them all, so I decided that I was going to start living in my art. So I took all the principles that I'd learned about sacred geometry and put them into designing my own little house. Sacred geometry is really no different than any other geometry, of course, because there is only one geometry. But when geometry is used to create sacred spaces, it's usually just called sacred geometry. It's also used in creating paintings and drawings that are religious works. And what's really interesting is that because the geometry is always the same, the meaning behind forms and numbers seems to be the same from culture to culture. So in an indigenous culture in Africa, you'd find the same sort of meaning and form that you'd find in an indigenous culture, or even a contemporary culture in the U.S. So you find these universals, and that's very interesting to me. Why do we share meaning? Because ultimately we are all looking for meaning. I think that's what we do as human beings, or one of our primary jobs. Even if there is no meaning, we assign meaning to things. And that's pretty much what I've taken on as my full-time job, just designing little structures that use archetypal form and number. One example of sacred geometry would just be the number 1 is usually representative of the divine, and the number 2 it points to the divine. It's the duality principle, which points to the divine. So in a gate, for example, if you're going through a door in a Buddhist shrine, 2 dragons, the duality will flank the singular divinity. If you can get past the duality into the singularity, you're in nirvana. So I always flank every door with a couple of windows or a couple of porch posts, and I just play around with it. I wouldn't say that it's a formula that I use to create things, because it's more like a language, a visual language. It's a little looser than a formula, because things can mean different things in different combinations, so there are an infinite variety of ways they can be combined. And certain proportions show up a lot. The proportion of 1 to 1.6 or 1.618, if you want to carry it out, that turns up in nature and in our built environment a lot, because it's a regenerative form or proportion. In any case, it's everywhere. So in my house, for example, the length to the width, and for that matter, the length to the height, or the width to the height, is in fact that same proportion. And a lot of that stuff just happens naturally. It doesn't necessarily evolve from conscious thought, but it just because we're part of nature. If we're letting things like that happen, they happen. It's interesting to me that they don't happen more in our built environment. Yeah, I think it's interesting that my tiny house has gotten so much attention, and yet there were other tiny houses before my tiny house, and there are a lot of other small houses. And when I look at some structures, big or small, they don't attract me. But I think there is an inherent draw towards structures that are ordered, and in this case, just ordered on these very universal principles. And on a subconscious level, I think that does appeal to people. Choosing what parts to include in a house and not include in a house is really important to me, and it's very, very fun for me. For example, the porch. might seem superfluous to some people. Most of those people have never, or some of those people have never lived without a porch, probably because having lived without a porch myself, I realized that I really like a transitional area where I can fumble for my keys when it's raining outside and not get all that wet, or where I can hang out, and it's sort of a medium space between social and private. And so things like porches and other seemingly not that important parts, I've thought about a lot, and for me they are actually important, so I include them. I think the balance of community and privacy is really important, and it's not very well achieved in many of our environments in this country. I've lived in some places that are totally void of community, or at least for the most part void of community, the suburbs namely. And there's just not much attention, well, paid to human needs in general there, because they're mostly created for cars. That was in their design. But the other side of that is I've actually lived here in Sonoma County in sort of hippie community things where there wasn't much privacy, and I couldn't take any of that because I need a little bit of privacy too. There are a lot of different ways that you can achieve your solitude through architecture, and in fact it's a lot more efficient, of course, if you can just if you've got a family, it's great if you can contain a little private space for each person within the one structure. That said, my marriage came with an additional structure which conveniently fits my needs perfectly, so I love to keep it as my house. That's the baby and my wife's house. Solitude is really more a psychological thing than a spatial or even a social thing. You don't really need all that much space typically to find solitude. It's as long as the people around you can respect your privacy and your solitude. That's kind of a tall order sometimes these days. But even just a little nook in the house could be enough if you're living with anything but the most extroverted people who, like my wife, would like to come along every 5 minutes and start talking. So, in my case, it's good to have a little house. It should be mentioned that a smaller house, all things being equal, a smaller house built of the same quality materials will be more expensive per square foot than a large house, because you've still got the expensive parts in there, like the heater, your stainless steel countertop. A lot of the core elements of a home are the expensive parts. Square footage is relatively cheap. In fact, it's about the cheapest thing you can add onto a house, which is kind of what the housing industry has been aiming towards for a long time. It's like the fast food of housing. It's big and cheap. Whether it's quality or not, or the square footage could be used, is another question. As you get smaller, things get more expensive per square foot, but of course they're cheaper overall. And in fact, my house was I believe it was the cheapest house in Iowa City, but also the most expensive per square foot. And it may be the same here in Sonoma County, I'm not sure. The great room is really just a couple of puffy chairs flanking a stainless steel fireplace, which makes the whole place glow at night. And a desk over on the other side of the room, which is where I spend most of my waking hours when I'm inside. And there's a lot of storage per square foot in this house because, that's a good way to open up the living space by having a lot of room for the stuff so I don't have to deal with it all the time. Beyond the great room, I've got this is the kitchen. And once again, a lot of storage, but typical kitchen stuff like a stovetop, propane-powered, a sink, and I've even got a little refrigerator and toaster oven down here. Beyond that, I've got the bathroom, which is just 2 feet by 4 feet. It's a wet bath, so the toilet is in the shower. The shower is the bathroom, and the drain is right in the floor. Transforming the bathroom into a shower isn't as complex as one might imagine it would be. I just cover the window so it doesn't get wet, and I cover the toilet so it doesn't get wet with this curtain, and then I close this door so the kitchen does not get wet, and I'm sealed in. Okay, so up here I've got the sleeping loft, which, as the name implies, is primarily for sleeping. And there's a little bit of storage up here too. Probably the hardest part after paring down all my stuff about living small is making the bed, so I don't. At least not very well. This window is great for ventilation, and it is just big enough that if there's a fire, I can get through it fairly easily. And it's quite a cozy little place up here for two. Any more than that, it gets a bit crowded. You know, as Americans, we love our houses big and cheap when we buy them. It looks like a great deal when you're buying a house for less money per square foot, and it's a big house, than the cheaper house that's more per square foot. But ultimately, the long-term costs are way more for a big house. I mean, really, you're paying so much less for a small space in which you're using all the space. A big house is going to require more heating, more cooling, more cleaning, roof replacement every once in a while, repainting, hundreds of hours worth of that stuff. Whereas, to repaint my house, to restain it, is really not that big a deal. All of my costs, for the most part, are really upfront costs, and I'm living free and clear ever since. I'm surprised. I'm not that surprised actually when I hear statistics around how much money it takes to retire or to live in this country. I take that with a grain of salt because those estimates are based on the laws that require us to live in so much square footage, and they don't really apply to somebody like me or a lot of my friends who live more simply than that. And I do know that when I retire, I certainly hope to have my community of tiny houses for all my friends with beds downstairs built by then. Before I can't climb up to my own loft, I hope to have this retirement home built. And I think there are a lot of options, and I think that these options are going to surface more and more as the boomers come of age and are requiring a lot more of these options. And so I look forward to seeing what comes out of the next decade or so. And I really think that I can already foresee a lot more small houses with beds downstairs and people living simply and recognizing the benefits and the luxuries of living simply. As far as the structures themselves go, they're built to be stronger than a standard house. They're built to go down very rough roads and stand up to pretty severe weather. In fact, if the big one ever comes out here in Northern California, I hope to be not in some other structure, but in this tiny house, because this one may be the last one standing, for all I know. So yeah, the appreciation-depreciation thing becomes an asset thing, and I don't pay that much attention to it because I just know that I am living cheaper and better than many people right now. But it is something that will come up someday.
But you could actually keep it in the family. You could pass this down, whereas you don't think of keeping your trailer in the family or even your RV really down generations.
Right. Yeah, I could definitely pass this through the generations. This could be like the family cottage that could be around for hundreds of years.